The following is a presentation of the Radio Misfits Podcast Network.
From the birthplace of modern winemaking, Sonoma, California, welcome to The Winemakers. Local experts Sam Couturi, Bart Hansen, and Brian Casey, along with host John Myers, invite you to listen in as they discuss all facets of winemaking. So sit back, pour yourself a glass, and let's hear what the guys have to say this week.
John's finally figured out the live start.
The cold intro.
Yeah.
That poured like
an ancient Lodi pour,
100,
baby.
and I'm trying to do quick math, but I can't. That was poured from 1886. That was an old pour.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to The Winemakers. I'm John Myers with Sam, Bart, Brian, and Greg LaFollette, co-owner of Marchelle Wines out near Occidental, fresh from the fields today, huh?
Yep.
Excellent. And Randy Caparoso, you are a freelance journalist and photographer, also from Lodi, right?
Yes.
Welcome, man. It's all about ancient vines from Lodi today, huh?
Yes.
That's a good thing. Randy, just step right up to that microphone and be as close as you can. And here we go.
Well, okay. Hello, everyone.
I think Randy's still trying to figure out how he got here. And I don't mean how he physically got here. Kind of like, why did they call me?
Right. You know, I don't know. Well, we're just getting to know each
Correct.
other. And so you
And that's a good enough reason to have you.
You probably don't know that I actually worked in the restaurant industry for over 30 years. You know, started as, washing dishes and bussing tables. And then I became a waiter, wearing tuxedos and doing Caesar salads at the table.
And where was this?
And this was all in Honolulu, which is my hometown.
Okay,
And
awesome.
then I became a sommelier. And back in 1978 was when I got my first sommelier job. And I've been working full time with wine ever since. I met a chef along the way named Roy Yamaguchi. We ended up opening about 20.
Right.
Yeah. We ended up opening 28 of those restaurants from Tokyo to New York. And then I retired. And about 2010, I moved to Lodi in amongst old vines, and I moved there to be among old vines. It just simply captivated me, and I've been there ever since now, 13 years. And I wrote a book called Lodi, ! The definitive guide and history of America's largest wine growing region. So, you fellas mentioned that you want this to be educational. A lot of people
Moderately educational.
yeah, still need to be educated on the fact, little known fact, that Lodi is actually the largest wine growing region in the United States. It produces more grapes than all of Napa Valley and Sonoma County combined. When you think of it, it produces more wine grapes than all of Washington State and Oregon State combined, plus another 25%.
Wow.
And so it's a big, large ocean of grapes there. When you walk into any store in the United States, or you can be in Denmark or Frankfurt or Shanghai, and you will see Lodi wines, and Lodi does produce the wines that Napa and Sonoma used to grow mostly. It wasn't long ago, maybe 40, 50 years ago, where wineries like E&J Gallo took more than half the grapes from Sonoma County and Napa Valley. They don't do that now, obviously, but now they get their grapes from Lodi.
Right. But so you're saying there was a time where Gallo actually purchased. I just want people to understand what you're saying. It's
that's a fact.
It's a big magnitude that like half the grapes here were bought by Gallo.
More than half.
It was smaller.
Well, more than half.
Okay. And it was smaller then, granted, but that's a massive amount of grapes going to one.
Those were the 50s, 60s, and really going into the 70s, of course. And the reason why, of course, they sourced from Napa and Sonoma was because those are great wine regions. And things shifted, obviously, in the 80s and 90s, where, land values and vineyards got a little bit higher and more competitive. And so Lodi is the region now where they get their wine grapes for the same reason, because it's a good, dependable wine region. It's Mediterranean climate, and it has extremely grape-friendly soils, very unusual soils, in fact. We're going to taste Zinfandels and Carignan today, and Cinsault. We're having Cinsault right now, and they come from the original appellation in Lodi called McCullummy River. And McCullummy is actually defined by a sandy loam alluvium called Tokay sandy loam. And it's typically in all parts of the appellation 80 to 100 feet deep. Now, I'm talking about sandy loam, very rich and fertile because it is an alluvium. It's all came down from the river. It's pulverized granite and extremely sandy. Not one piece of gravel or rock in it going down 100 feet deep. If you can imagine that, and then you might understand why Lodi is so grape friendly, has been since the 1850s. And up until the 70s, their major grape was a table grape called Tokay. The only problem with Flame Tokay was it had a seed in it. And so, as you know, by the 70s and 80s, consumers were done with grapes with seeds in it. I mean, just like you can't find a watermelon with a seed these days. It's just, those things don't exist. You know, the scientists have sort of wiped them off. And so, but Lodi at that time transitioned to wine grapes because that's when Robert Mondavi went out to Lodi in 79 and founded Woodbridge because he wanted to produce everyday wines, not just ultra premium wines. And Mondavi actually graduated from Lodi High School, so he was familiar with the region. And
wait, that's a little piece of history that needs not glossing over. That Robert Mondavi graduated from Lodi High School.
Yes, well, his father, Cesare, old timers remember the label C.K. Mondavi.
Right.
Yeah, that's all in tribute to Cesare and his wife Rosa, and 2 sons and 2 daughters. They all moved to Lodi in 1921, bought a little house in the center of town because they heard at that time grape packing was a big business. They came down from Minnesota. And so he has established a business, was very successful. All the kids went to Stanford. And eventually, of course, the 2 sons, Peter and Robert, convinced Dad to buy that defunct winery called Charles Krug in Napa Valley. And so the sons moved to Napa, operated Napa until they had a famous fist fight, and Robert went off and started his own winery. I believe that was in 66. In the meantime, though, Cesare and Rosa lived in downtown Lodi till the end of their days. But they were officially owners until they died,
right,
of Charles Krug. And then it went to Peter. I think he lived to like 101 or something. And so Charles Krug is still in the hands of the Mondavi family, which is amazing when you think of it.
And more than you can say about Robert Mondavi.
So Lodi has a great history, and Mondavi was cognizant of the fact that you can grow Cabernet, you can grow Sauvignon Blanc, you can grow Merlot, all these grapes for just a small percent of the price that it was getting to be in places in Napa Valley. And so that's the modern day story. He was a big influence on the farmers in Lodi. And again, I mentioned I'm explaining that roundabout history where wine became very popular in the 1980s. And so that was when the transition in Lodi went from table grapes to wine grapes, because that was needed at the time. We were all around in the you were at Kenwood, right? Right. And we were all around. I was a sommelier. I made my first trip to Napa and Sonoma in 1979. And so I'm lucky enough to have, also lived and worked through those eras, the modern day era, I guess, of California, and seeing the growth. Along the way, met this fellow here, Greg LaFollette, and the original winemakers at Flowers, and then Tandem, and then
Yeah, a bunch of
Yes, and Marchelle, now
Marchelle.
Marchelle. But remember, the amazing thing was, back in the 1980s, especially in the 70s, no one would ever imagine you can grow a wine grape south of Sonoma town. I mean, it was viewed as, physically impossible to ripen a grape in what was now called Sonoma Coast or Sebastopol. Sebastopol was all apple trees and things like that. But no one could imagine that. The thought was, you could put a grapevine there, but it'll never ripen. And so, and those are different times, and it's hard to imagine that time existed. The idea that you can't grow a grape in Sonoma Coast. I mean, that's crazy.
So call it 1986, 87. I took one of my first classes at Santa Rosa JC, Rich Thomas teaching the class, and being from Petaluma, I said, how come there's no vineyards? There's only like one vineyard in Petaluma. And Rich would go, you can't grow anything down there. He goes, they tried pre-prohibition, and there's a reason why they never put it back. Right. And that's kind of an interesting concept, because now look at all of them out on Lakeville Highway.
Well, first of all, there wasn't the concept of Pinot Noir probably is better in a colder climate, and so is Chardonnay. But there also was people didn't know how to grow grapes. California Sprawl was the name of the game all the way up into the 70s. And nothing will ripen under a dense canopy like that. And so, so viticulture had to change, and winemaking thought process had to change, and consumers had to change. Everything had to change, and that didn't happen overnight. But when you think about it, it happened pretty quickly. Yeah. So now I'm in Lodi, and I'm comfortable there. After working in opening up restaurants in New York and Chicago and Texas, and always specializing in wine. I always wanted to live in a wine region, and I can go to bed and not hear a car driving by. Just you and the crickets. And I found a place like that in Lodi, and exciting thing for me is, even though grapes have been planted there since the 1850s, it's actually considered up and coming. Even though it's the largest wine growing region easily in all of California and the United States, it's considered new. And that's because a lot of people just aren't aware. And here's the thing. We're going to taste 4 wines today, and 3 of them are varietals, and they come from vineyards planted in 1886, 1889, and 1900, all on their own rootstocks because of that sandy soil. Right. And it's staggering when you think about it. And you guys went out to Lodi, and you maybe saw some of those old vines, and they do at some point stop to look like vines, which are like creepy, crawly things, more like little bonsai trees, or in some cases, large bonsai trees with large trunks, very long spurs, sometimes longer than the trunks, typically, like the royalty. The spurs are all longer than the trunks. And so what you got these deep roots going down 50 feet, and you got these tremendous sap flow, rich earth, extremely well drained, so to speak, because that's the name of the game with grapevines. You want richness, but you want well drained, and so these vines are extremely healthy at over 130 years old, and so a lot of people think, old vine, that means very low yield and very concentrated wines, and that is sort of a misunderstanding. If a grapevine, even over 100 years old, was producing very little, and you're not making any money, and so that vine would not exist. These grapevines exist for over 50, 75, over 100 years because they're extremely productive.
Well, and
And so this whole idea that, it's, extremely low yield and all that, it's kind of bullshit. Just a misunderstanding. And then you also notice that, when these vines get old, they don't produce concentrated monolithic wines. They produce actually very fine, delicate, transparent, nuanced, delineated wines. And that's another reason why they exist. If they produce shitty wines, they would be long gone. If they produce wines with no character, they would be long gone. If they didn't produce grapes to a point where you can make some money off them, they would be long gone. And so these vines are existing over 100 years because they fulfill all those requirements of a really good old vine growth. And that is the story of it, folks. If you really want to understand old vines, it's a nuanced thing.
Well, and can we talk about that a little bit? These vineyards survived both Prohibition and the Flame Tokai, grape era, and then the transition to, California sprawl and Cabernet and Chardonnay dominating the market,
Phylloxera
and all these things.
They're impervious to phylloxera.
But
Phylloxera doesn't live
right, the sand isn't in the sand.
Well, it's there. It's just it doesn't proliferate.
Right. So, but I mean, specifically the sort of cultural influences, both Prohibition and the Flame Tokai era. How did they survive that? Just because they were still producing good wine? Were they selling, were the Bechtold selling to
Well, you mentioned Prohibition.
wine?
That's a misunderstanding, too, because I mentioned the Mondavis came over to Lodi at the beginning of Prohibition in 1921 for a very specific reason, because there was a big boom in grape growing. And in fact, at that time, the growers in Lodi were hastily planting as much wine grapes as they could, because there was a certain part of the Volstead Act that allowed every household to produce up to 200 gallons of their own wine. So overnight, when they banned the commercial sale of alcohol, which of course we know didn't prevent people from making it and drinking it anyway, but theoretically it was against the law. But overnight, thousands of Americans from coast to coast became home winemakers. So they needed wine grapes. And so, and Lodi had the train stops, and
that was one of my questions.
That could get it over to Chicago and Grand Central Station, New York, all those places.
I was wondering if the train tracks were there before or after grape production.
They went in the 1860s.
Okay.
And so and the Transcontinental Railroad one, was that finished in the 1870s?
1865
something.
I didn't know this was going to be a history test.
Yeah. No, well, that had a lot to do with
the whole thing.
All those places.
Well, that's how Rossi Ranch survived. Is they would take the grapes down to the Kenwood train station and load it up, and it'd end up in New York.
Right.
That's where the wine went too, and they would, they were still making wine during Prohibition for the church out of
And
Rossi
some of
Ranch.
those grapes went from Lodi into Napa Valley, which is why you have a Lodi Avenue in Napa, with the little train stop there.
Right.
So where there's tracks, you can get grapes.
So to kind of bring this around, Greg, when you were at Davis studying, what was your knowledge of Lodi as far as grapes? What was your knowledge of Lodi old vines? Like, was that even on your radar? So let's start with that with you.
Okay. Well, my family were Dust Bowl Okies. They came out to Oklahoma doing migrant farm work, and then they started doing farming themselves. They were dairy farmers. But
In what part of the state?
Holsteins?
Holstein, well, all different kinds. You have to have like a brown Swiss or two to get the butterfat content up in your milk, so you can sell it for more.
Such a Petaluma question.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, yeah, my family's dairy farmers, but yeah, so Central Valley, and so I was aware of the Lodi area. My dad graduated from Hillmar High School, just a little south of there, but this is a very little known fact that the very first wine that we made out at Flowers was a Lodi-based wine called the Perennial. And I think they still make Perennial to this day. But we had bought these beautiful redwood fermenters. They were brand new, and we didn't want to put our precious Pinot in them. So I talked to the More Fry Ranch and got, at that time, it was maybe 85-year-old Zinfandel. And we did a semi-carbonic fermentation in those redwood vats so that we could get the woodiness out of it. And we were just going to bulk that off. And lo and behold, it made really good wine. So what we did was the first Perennial, and for all the years that I was there, always was at least half Lodi grapes from the More Fry Old Vine Zinfandel. That's a small trivia that maybe the Flowers folks don't want you to know, but
I mean, I'm going to say to all you hipster winemakers out there,
Right.
you know,
Semi-carbonic and
Right.
redwood vats.
and you probably weren't born.
What year was that?
oh, let's see, that was 97. So
Okay.
we were making wine a couple of years before then, but that's when the winery was built and first, and we had to get grapes to put in there.
And you did say redwood tanks.
Yes, those were redwood tanks.
Were those some of the first new redwood tanks being ordered?
Last of the new.
Yeah.
Last of the new?
The last
Yeah.
of the new old redwood tanks.
I actually had to find an old guy to make new tanks because people just weren't doing it anymore. And in fact, I was also using dairy tanks. William Sellium still uses them, but after I left Flowers pretty quickly, those redwood tanks and the dairy tanks got sold off. And in fact, I still use some of those redwood tanks that we used up at Flowers originally. And I think the redwoods got sold to Deerfield Ranch here in Sonoma.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I love those old redwood tanks.
Oh, yeah.
You can still see like, a forest of them, like at wineries like Parducci. They're just amazing.
Well, and Joel Peterson is using them for. If you go into the Bedrock Winery, there's a bunch of them lined up for
Once in future.
once in future. Yeah.
And those were old Ravenwood tanks that he took with him.
Right.
So
Yeah, same sort of deal. Take, buy the tanks, leave the winery gets sold, buy the tanks back for
Right.
way less than you bought them the first time.
I did that, yeah.
Right.
So to go back to, so then how else was like Lodi? I mean, well, I guess you were very aware of the old vines, but did you continue to work with that fruit then, or was that when you kind of started really just kind of concentrating on Pinot and Chard?
Well, I was mostly doing Pinot and Chard at the time because my postgraduate work was on how Burgundian winemaking techniques affect mouthfeel. And I think you attended one of those.
The UC Davis rave.
Yeah,
Recent
advances in viticulture and enology. But at that time,
It's definitely not like the raves that I went to.
no. But it could have been. In fact, those French guys really knew how to drink at the speaker parties before, because once every other year we'd have a debate on Pinot and Chardonnay, and once every other year it would be in the United States, and once every other year in Burgundy. And so there was a lot of information being disseminated, and I knew, because I'd studied Pinot and Chardonnay, I knew where the bodies were buried. I knew that Pinot Noir is not called the heartbreak grape for no reason. And I knew there was no way in hell I was going to be crazy enough to actually make Pinot Noir. I'd studied it, and I knew how difficult it was going to be. But I kind of got pulled almost kicking and screaming back into the world of Pinot and Chard. Everywhere I went around the world, they'd always say, well, what about this? What about that with Pinot and with Chardonnay? And so finally I basically threw my hands up in the air and I said, Pinot, take me, I'm yours. And so I spend a lot less money now on things like therapy and stuff like that. It's a lot easier. But I've always had a soft spot in my head for for Lodi fruit ever since those early days, and it always kept coming back to me. Time and again, the Lodi would show up on my doorstep. And so same kind of thing as with Pinot. I finally embraced my my predilection for these Lodi areas. And in fact, there was this book called Steve Hymoff wrote a book called like the new winemakers of America or something like that. And each winemaker had a chapter. And Steve would ask the winemaker at the end the same question. If you were to make wine in Lodi, would you elevate the region? And Mark Aubert actually said, no, you got to be kidding. And it's you can buy it on Amazon. You can read it. And Steve said, no, I'm serious. He goes, well, of course, if I made wine in Lodi, I would elevate but he called it the outer Siberia of winemaking. And, and when Steve Hymoff asked me that question for the end of my chapter, I said, well, I already do work in Lodi, and I love Lodi. The people there are very real and genuine. They're farmers. They're like me. And I love making Lodi grapes. They help make me better. So, and Mark and I haven't spoken since then, by the way.
Well, I think there was a lot of misunderstanding, and there's still a lot of misunderstanding. A lot of people still think Lodi is somewhere near Bakersfield.
Right.
You know, it takes a few hours to drive from Lodi to Bakersfield. We're a long ways from that.
And a few degree days difference.
And
also.
folks, we're closer to Sacramento, which, as you know, is a pretty lush place.
Look, I mean, the way I always think of Lodi is it's just the other end of Highway 12, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, you can be from Lodi and drive and not leave, you know, you have to make some left and right turns, but Lodi all the way to Sebastopol, it's all the same highway. Right.
It's on the way up to the Amador County in the Sierra foothills. Right. It's the flatter area in between. But like I said, with those soils that are just amazing. And
so can we talk about
climate,
this specific wine? Because we have some great wines here.
This is Cinsault, and so Cinsault is your quintessential Mediterranean grape. You know, it's the grape of southern France. And so this comes from a vineyard. Again, it was planted in 1886. And it was planted at the request of a winery called El Pinal, which was a wine, started as a nursery in Stockton. I believe it was established in around 1855. And then about 3 years later, they established a winery. And then they started contracting Lodi growers, because even though they were in Stockton, they knew that the richer soils were in Lodi, and there were more farmers there. So this vineyard used to go to El Pinal all the way up to Prohibition. And then for many, many years, it went to hardly anyone. It went mostly to home winemakers. And here's the thing. It was called, the grapes that when they came from the nursery in Stockton, it was labeled as Black Malvoisie, Malvoisie. And so that, unknown to everyone, was actually the working name for Cinsault. It's just that people actually didn't discover that. And you're not going to believe it, but this is typical California wine industry until 2004. It's just like no one knew where Zinfandel came from, right? Until the 70s, and no one, and we had two types of Gamay grapes that weren't even Gamay. You know, that everyone bottled as Gamay,
Napa Gamay,
or Gamay Beaujolais, and you know that this is so Napa, and of course all of California used to think Petit Syrah was the same grape as Syrah. And believe it or not, it wasn't that long ago when people did think that. And of course, we bottled Chardonnay as Pinot Chardonnay, thinking it was part of the Pinot family. So there's a lot of screwy things in the industry, and there was the screwy things about this Cinsault. And so they didn't realize it was in the ground until Kay Bogart at the UC Davis had it identified. And the day after, people like Randall Graham and Bonnie Doon were rushing up to Lodi to get as much as they could, because it was like, oh my God, not only is there Cinsault in the ground, but you say is dry farm Cinsault that's been there since 1886. That's insane. And not only that, super healthy fruit, amazing. So I don't think this is much different than working with Pinot Noir, and you can tell me that, but because it's like Zinfandel and Lodi, these are relatively thinner skin, and so they're very delicate and transparent. They make soft tannin wines, but extremely spicy and again delineated.
Yeah. All right. Well, the way I make this wine, I make it under what are called the Lodi Native Society, under their rules, which is basically the ingredients are grapes. You add some SO2 later on, but you don't add anything else. Water, acid, sugar, nothing. Yeah. That's all it comes from it.
We have a Lodi Native group where you can't do anything.
and like, how big a group is that? And...
at the most it's only been about 9 winemakers at the most.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So when I first saw this fruit, I actually knew I wasn't going to be getting it because it is the world's oldest Cinsault, and a lot of the world's oldest of any kind of vines are usually no longer in Europe because of phylloxera, but because of the sandy soil, there it is. And I was actually working with the Lodi Wine Grape Association, teaching best practices, and the owner of the Bechtold Vineyard at that time offered me for free 1.3 tons of the oldest Zinfandel in the area, the Royal Tea Vineyard, which we're going to taste. And that turned out so good that a couple of years later, he offered me for purchase, of course, at this time, because I felt guilty about taking grapes for free from farmers, 1 ton of the Cinsault, and that was in 2019. So this is a very new varietal for me, but it has a lot of Pinot sensibility to it. And in fact, was it Elliot who said that my Zinfandel tasted like a Russian River Pinot winemaker made it? So this is kind of the same way. It's light in texture.
What a compliment.
Yeah. And but it does have
Don't let that compliment slap you in the back of the head.
Right. So this has like some what the French would call sauvage et animal, savage and animal. It's got some smoked meats, roasted venison. There's no new oak in it, but it's got this feral, visceral quality that my wife calls sex in a bottle. And as long as she likes wines like this, I'll keep making them for her till the cows come home.
But this also has a quality of Cinsault that you don't find in all Cinsauts, which is a very pronounced kitchen spice quality, So there's traces of those brown spices like clove, cardamom, those type of spices, and then especially when you do it with native yeast, you get a lot of interaction, and so that I think that natural style tends to bring out those nuances in the grape. We have Cinsault in younger vines in Lodi too, and so in younger vines, the fruit quality, which is tends to be overwhelmingly like black cherries and strawberries, that's what you smell the most. But in these old vines, you really get those nuances of spice, and you really see the beauty of it. You can, and if anyone's interested in this type of wine, if you need other than Bechtold Cinsaults, and there's luckily about a dozen wineries that do produce Cinsauts like Turley.
Right. Sure. When I think of Bechtold, I think of Turley, right?
A bunch of them, but you can find fairly old vine Cinsault from South Africa, and they're not over 100 years old, but you can find them made from vineyards 40 or 50 or 60 years old, and those are wonderful wines too. Very, very similar in a sense.
Isn't Pinotage a cross with Cinsault and something?
Yes, it's yeah.
You're looking at me, not.
Right, I don't know.
Oh, the sommelier should know.
Somebody should know. You're the sommelier.
Pinot and Cinsault, right?
Yeah, it's Pinot Noir Cinsault, and so and that's Pinotage, and of course, the offspring doesn't resemble the grape. The parentage,
not on vine or on wine, right? Yeah.
Right. But there can be good Pinotage. So
that's another show.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've had some really good Pinotage.
Yeah, there can be, and Pinotage, grows great in Stellenbosch and all these regions. It actually grows pretty well in Lodi, believe it or not.
I was going to say, is there any Lodi Pinot Touch?
Yes, there is. There are a few vineyards of that.
What's Carignan next?
Yeah, shall we taste the Carignan?
I think maybe let's taste the Zin next because
let's
it's
do the
not.
Zin.
It's a little less heavy. Because the Zinfandel is not just Zinfandel. Back in the old days when they planted these in the 1880s, the Spenker family also planted this just a few years after the Cinsault. They didn't just plant Zinfandel. They also had shotgun approach scattered in there, Flame Tokay, which is a table grape, Mission grapes, with the first grape into California from the missionaries. There's also Carignan in there, about 8% Carignan. But there's some white varietals in there too, like maybe there's a vine or two of Malvasia Bianca and some Muscat and the
Black
color-wise,
Prince.
I'm
And the
saying
Black Prince.
and Black Prince.
no Alicante, though.
No
In this one, there's no Alicante. Actually, in the Carignan, we're going to taste.
There's some Alicante.
Just a smattering of Alicante. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But so what I do with all those other white and table grape varietals, you're not going to get a whole lot of extract out of them. So what I do instead is I take all those whole clusters and we put them into the bottom of the fermenter. And then that is done semi-carbonic.
Wait, so you're separating out the white varieties
and the table grapes.
And the table
So all
So that's in the vineyard. Then they're picking.
no, we have to separate them.
Oh, you're like you're like putting it on the sorting
also
table and pulling out.
picked together and put in the same bin, but when they get to the winery, he separates.
It's like,
Yeah.
How can you make making Lodi Zinfandel more complicated and difficult? Okay,
Well,
I dig it.
It gets a little worse than that too, because
we'll let you go on.
yeah, even more complicated because when you do all those grapes, whole cluster in the bottom, every single berry becomes its own individual fermentation vessel. So it creates these nice esters and things like that, which is part of what you're smelling in here. But we use a little wooden 1-ton basket press, and I've been using it for decades. And it is so gentle, even though it can go up to about 5 atmospheres, it does not break those grapes. So my poor wife, when she's shoveling out our 1-ton fermenters or the dairy tank and handing me the bucket and I'm pouring it into our basket press, I'm having to crush those grapes with my hands, or she kicks them off to the side. And when she gets down low enough, she treads them, stomps on them, so that about 10% of this wine is actually the physical volume of wine is actually hand pressed or foot treaded.
So
that's kind of fun.
I'm speechless. That's amazing.
Are you at your own facility? Because most custom crush places would not let you do that, probably.
definitely his own facility.
Well, it's not my facility, but there are a few of us who are called do-it-yourselfers,
Like-minded.
Like-minded, and they allow us.
Crazy.
Yes, we do all of our own work, but you got to remember that my wife and I raised 6 kids out on the Sonoma coast, so child slave labor was a big part of our growing up, and we kind of got used to having those little clever hands squishing grapes and treading.
They're pretty good at that.
Yeah.
I will say this because I'm actually tasting the 2020 Royalty Zinfandel for the first time too. So I just want if it's just me and Greg here, I would tell Greg that this vintage kind of reflects the way you kind of like, I think you've mentioned before, like push a dragon's tail a little bit. It really skirts the edge. There's an earthiness to it that's very Lodi. That's terroir, but there's also those microbial sort of interactions that you get from these processes that creates, again, unusual spices and unusual scents. Again, you're going right up against what people would call dirty winemaking, but somehow you manage to keep out of the mud, and so what you end up with, if someone tasted this wine blind, I first of all, I wouldn't think they would think it's even a Zinfandel.
No,
they might even think, oh, it's some kind of funky Pinot.
Certainly not Lodi Zinfandel. The common perception of Lodi
because
Zinfandel.
It's way too fragrant, it's way too spiced, and it's very delicate and soft, and it's great acid.
Yeah.
And it has all the things that people don't associate with Zinfandel. Here's the ironic part. It's actually the essence of a Lodi Zinfandel. Because Lodi doesn't make what people think of it as Zinfandel. Now, there's a lot of Zinfandels on the market that say Lodi on the label, but let's be honest, folks. Those are the kind of wines that are picked at 30 bricks, a ton of water added, acid adjusted, 25% Petit Syrah, lots of oak, and lots of sticks of oak. And so those are made, those commercial wines are made to fulfill people's, assumption is this is what Zinfandel is supposed to taste like. This is real Zinfandel. Yeah, this is what it actually tastes like.
Well, I might add that Marchelle Wines, one of our main goals is to have a wine have a definite sense of place from where it comes. And you can't get a wine like this from anywhere else other than the Royal Tea Zinfandel block at Jesse's Grove. And using these old vines and whole clusters, you just don't find that anywhere else.
I like how you said it skirts the edge. I mean, when I first smelled it, it had that white pepper and definitely kind of showed some Zinfandel characters, and I knew it was Zin, so I'm prefacing that. But then it completely changed by the time I got back to it. It's just spectacular.
I think most people would say this doesn't taste like Zinfandel.
Right. As it's been in the glass, it's starting to me smell more like Zinfandel, but definitely.
No,
it is unique to the wine, the place, and the winemaking.
Well, people don't think of Zinfandel as being floral, correct, or fragrant or earthy. But so it doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't fit in people's worldview of what Zinfandel is supposed to be like. But like I said, ironically, it is the essence of Lodi Zinfandel. It's just that most people have never tasted real Zinfandel from Lodi. And here it is, folks.
One of the interesting things about Decanter Magazine is every year they list like 10 of the best Zins in America, that kind of thing. And Jeff Cox, who writes for them, came up to me one time and said, I hear you have pretty good Zin. So I went through and tasted it. That with him along with other things, and he bought some wine, and a few months later, coming out of Decanter Magazine was our Zinfandel in there, along with 9 other Zins, very famous in America. And that kind of blew me away because I think the Brits have a broader understanding of wine in general, and so they're not pigeonholing a Zinfandel into that category, and they really liked this Zinfandel.
Right. Mm-hmm. So, excuse me, who else was on that list? Do you remember any of them? And do they taste anywhere near yours?
No. In fact, when we had ZinFest before the pandemic, I think there were 20 Zins.
Yeah.
And mine was the only one that you could pick out in the lineup just by looking at it. It was also 13.5 alcohol, and the next closest Zinfandel was 15.1. So it stood out, and they were all blind, but I could pick mine out from across the room.
He's talking about we did a blind tasting, and there were about 100 people in the room. But in this blind tasting, half of those wines were not from Lodi. There were 10 Lodi wines and 10 mostly from Sonoma and Napa. I think we had one from Paso Robles and one from Contra Costa. And so there was a very famous winemaker sitting in the front row, and he raised his hand and said, well, this wine doesn't taste like Zinfandel at all. It tastes like Pinot Noir. And of course, we knew this was Greg's wine because Greg kind of like he's the only guy wearing overalls in a room full of winemakers. And his wine sticks out like a sore thumb, too, in a blind tasting.
I can usually pick my wines out. We have, for instance, a Vanderkamp annual tasting. I can always pick mine out just by sense of smell, as can my wife. When she's walking through the winery, she'll go walking by all these vats, and she knows which one is a particular wine just because it really smells like that particular site.
During fermentation.
Right.
During fermentation.
Well, Greg, you have to remember, does not follow safe winemaking protocols.
Yeah, I don't practice safe winemaking. That's true.
And so, but consequently, you know, which is why I've been a big fan of Greg's forever. So as a restaurateur, I bought all his wines because I love showing the wines. It's like, you know, again, I would show a La Folette made wine to a guest or to a friend, and I will always say, this is not going to be what you expect, which is what I like in wine. I hate predictability. Yeah,
Hey,
it's
Greg.
not interesting.
Yeah, Greg, with your, background, more technical background, would you say that you've always kind of been that way with not following the rules, or is that something you had to build into comfortability? I mean, your first job was at Beaulieu, is that correct?
Well, my very first job in the industry was under Zilma Long in 1984 at Simi Winery.
Which would have been very UC Davis kind of technical, correct?
Yeah, and so when
Well,
actually...
Greg is UC Davis.
Yeah.
Well, no, I understand that, but that's where I'm going is like you
Right.
started out with that, here are the boxes, fill the boxes, and get to the end, and enjoy the wine, right?
Well, I think since the get-go, like when I started working under Zelma, I got a lot of really good technical training, and also working under Andre Cheleschev at Beaulieu, got very good technical training. But when I would go to Davis and the professors would say, "Oh, this is what happens when you do this, so don't go there," I would say, "Oh, cool, I'm going to try that out."
Right. Don't press the red button.
I pressed all the buttons. Yep. We did have some nuclear launches, but mostly I learned a lot in the early days. And you have to remember too that I was what you call a international conslutting winemaker. Conslutting because you just hire out your sensory organs to the highest bidder, and basically to be a conslutting a winemaker means that you're just getting paid to learn from other people's mistakes.
Yeah.
So I would go to places like Chile and Australia, or there's also, I have non-disclosure agreements with some pretty big wineries here in California that
Let's mention them all.
that screwed up, and
Let's get sued.
yeah, and so it was my job to fix problems, and in doing that, you kind of learn how to avoid problems as well.
Or how to utilize problems to make better wine.
It's a problem is another word for opportunity, and it is
Right.
indeed tickling the dragon's tail.
That's what you say, tickling, not
Yeah,
or you're kind of pushing it a little bit, like, oh,
yeah. So
that hurt.
So I'm probably the most high-tech, low-tech winemaker you'll probably never meet. So
It's beautiful when it's applied to grapes like these, which for old vines, not that are very transparent, and so we got Greg to come back out to Lodi on a consistent basis in 2012, if you recall, and that's when we were starting our Lodi Native project. Where we're telling winemakers that you had to pick a heritage vineyard, but you have to make wine from it, and we'll put it all under one label, but it would be labeled by the name of the vineyard rather than your brand. And you can't do anything, So Greg came out and gave some pep talks to the winemakers, because some of them had experience with that, and others had zero experience. So they had to be, sort of reassured that it's okay. It's okay to go this route, And some winemakers were saying, "Oh, you mean you don't want us to make good Zinfandel? You want us to make it shitty?" And but no, and we would say, "No, we don't want you to make great Zinfandel or shitty Zinfandel. We want you to make a Zinfandel that tastes like where it came from."
Right.
And so imagine that. And so now everyone is doing it that way. Yeah, and so it's sort of changed, that sort of approach to Zinfandel. Yeah, so even some of the commercial wineries have started to do that as well. They might still be making a commercial style Zinfandel, by formula, and that's what they're selling, from Asia all the way up to Northern Europe. But they're also making some interesting, very transparent terroir focus vineyard Zinfandels, and so that's great. And
and can I ask you, Randy, when the shift in the Lodi winemaking world went from just making Lodi Zinfandel to calling out these vineyard designates, and when did Turley start doing Bechtold?
Well,
and because now and we have winemakers who come on the show and name these.
Well, Turley is a big influence. They actually started making wine from the Royalty Vineyard that we were just tasting.
Right,
they started, I believe, in 1998, and I could be wrong. Could be 1999. So they actually made a few vintages from that vineyard
and labeled it as that vineyard.
Turley, yes,
Okay.
but they call it Spankerach.
Okay.
Yeah, and once in a while, still, Tegan Pasalaco from Turley will pull out, 21 or 22-year-old bottling from that vineyard, and they're still fresh and lively and amazing. And and Turley loved the vineyard. They just decided to move on when, like happens a lot in their history. Maybe they didn't see exactly eye to eye with the grape grower, and so they got a nice long-term contract with a vineyard on the east side of Lodi called Dogtown, and so they still make Dogtowns, and they're amazing wines, and those are also 20-25-year Zinfandels, by the way. Amazing acidity, kind of like the Perlagos Brothers Stampede vineyards. It's just on the other side of the river, but it produces Zinfandels with a lot of acid, which is unusual for Lodi, actually. But then now Turley, I believe they make wine from no less than 6 different vineyards in Lodi, including the Bechtold Sansol, and they actually make the most Sansol of all the wineries that pull from it. They get a huge chunk of it, and they do it sort of, Cru Beaujolais style, which is what Pasalaco kind of likes. So he calls it Poron because he believes it's a nice quaffing wine. Yeah, but there's complexity to it. Yeah.
Is it fair to say that the old vines hold acid better and they can make those more structured wines as opposed to new plantings of Zinfandel in the Lodi area that tend to be cropped heavier? And again, I know crop level is not the issue, but
I think the issue of young and old has more to do with physical development of a vine. So even Turley might have a vineyard, and they have many vineyards now that they control up and down the state. They might have vineyards where vines are 100 years old, 50 years old, 25 years old, and maybe they're all sort of head trained in that fashion with a single stake. But they'll always tell you the best wines come from the oldest vines. And in fact, they don't just, it's not just a belief. It's actually something that they know because they pick it separately, and then they can compare the TAs and compare it on a sensory level, and they can clearly see the older vines tend to make better balanced wines with more acidity. And that's more of a physiological development. Like I said, older vine, you have more developed trunk and spurs and deeper rooting systems, and so invariably those vines produce a better wine with better numbers. Yeah.
And the vines are more balanced,
right.
So they're not stressed as much. So
they
don't have to shed acid when it gets.
No, it's another matter with trellis Zinfandel. I think it's pretty much proven that Zinfandel is better off head train or on a stake or freestanding or bush or whatever you want to call it. Because when you when you train it on the trellis, it has less opportunity to develop that structural that basic structure that gives older vines a chance, which is why trellis vines after 20 or 30 years they tend to give way to disease pressures and dead arm and all kinds of things, and so your typical trellis vineyard all around the world is replaced after 20 or 30 years. Your average vine in Napa Valley, for instance, is less than 20 years old, and because they're a trellis region, and so it's a system too. The vines were, it's interesting because now there's a lot of talk about redoing pruning methods of trellis vines, but it's all based on the idea of how can we duplicate the natural style of growth that you get in a head trained vine, to create just a stronger structure. So, and that the end product is in the wine. It's in the grapes, the TA, pH, and balance of flavor and sugar. So
Cool.
Sam, I've got a lot of questions about head trained and trellised. Why is it that way? And do you guys, how do you do it in Enterprise?
I mean, first of all, I think the decline of commercial trellised vines, part of it is the farming system, but also those vines are also typically getting heavy doses of herbicides and other chemicals that are going to hurt. You're spraying Roundup on a plant, and Roundup is designed to kill plants, and eventually it kills the plants. So I think that's a piece of it. We have trellised Cabernet at Cayman Vineyard that's 40 years old and is still going strong. So the farming aspect of that is a huge piece of it for sure. But in the same way that like olive trees, when they're planted, dry farmed, large spacings, allowed to be the way that they want to be, will live 500 years. But right now the trend in olive oil production is high density, low small plantings, and those trees start to decline after 15 or 20 years.
Yeah, they're trimmed like bushes.
Yeah.
And so again, disease pressure,
right?
And and after a while it's not
just
worth it.
Maximum extraction, and then you move on. There's really interesting work going on, and we're working with some pruning consultants, Simonite and Search. I never say it right. And that's definitely
that's what I'm talking.
That's exactly
about.
And taking
methodology.
that concept of that sort of bonsai head trained vine and how to apply that sort of same physiology to the trellis plants. And we've seen some really interesting results using some of their methodology in the last few years. Yeah. Definitely making those Cabernet vines particularly
it's pruning
stronger
to create more wood and more sap flow
without doing cordones and things like that, where you get susceptible to dead arm and things like that.
Ironically, though, pruning trellis vines to duplicate as much as possible what comes more natural on
100%
on a head trained vine, a freestanding vine, because a vine is a vine. It's actually like I said, it's a creepy crawly thing, but when it's allowed to grow like a head trained vine, it's Simonette, I think they use the term, it's more natural.
Right. Well, and as we move into these like drought, boom and bust sort of years, having some serious trunk and spurs for places for the vines to store carbohydrates and build strength to get through the dry years, in a wet year like this, soak up as much as they can. I think it makes a lot of sense to sort of reevaluate these pruning practices and training practices that we've done for the last 30, 40 years.
Absolutely. When it comes, it's more and more important because of everyone's recent experience with continuous drought and heat, high heat.
Yeah, and I'm just like my mouth is watering. It's on the finish. It's just like I feel like I have more water in my mouth than if I took a sip of
Well,
water.
this
It's
one
just like
has beautiful acidity.
Amazing.
Just a moderate amount of tannin. This vineyard is planted in 1900 on its own rootstock, and it's Carignan, so the vines are a little bit larger than a Zinfandel would get, so they have a tendency to tip over, and but it's just a beautiful vineyard, and the family, the Spankers, they just planted a whole load of them. A lot of people don't realize, but by the time the California wine industry got into the 50s and 60s and 70s, Carignan was the most widely planted red wine variety in California. More Carignan, more than Cabernet, far more than Pinot. Pinot was almost unheard of, and so was Merlot. But Carignan used to be the workhorse grape for California, and to make especially jug red wines, Gallo, Hardy Burgundy, etc. And they use a lot of Zinfandel in that too. But it works all over California because it is, again, like Cinsault, it's a Mediterranean grape. It's a grape of southern France, and it's grown all over Spain and in Africa. It loves warm climate. California is basically, a beach state. It's a hot climate state, and so Carignan is an easy thing. It fell out of popularity once Merlot and Cabernet and then Pinot Noir became popular. So now there's not a lot of Carignan even in Lodi. But the Carignan that we do have tends to be on the old side. And so that's a wonderful thing. And so it's a beautiful wine. Carignan should have a lot of black cherry, and a lot of red fruit, and it's known for its acidity, which is why it was so popular in Zinfandel blocks. It could add acidity to it, because it's actually a grape that takes and it needs another 2 or 3 weeks, to ripen. But if you pick it at the same time as Zinfandel, it definitely can add that acid
punch
balance to it. And so, great.
Can we talk about the winemaking on this, little Greg?
Yeah,
or maybe making Carignan in general.
Well,
what you know about it, what you've learned.
Carignan is a little like Zinfandel in that it's a fairly plastic grape. It can really push me, pull you. You can stretch and shape it in different ways. Syrah can be a bit like that too, which is why Shiraz and Carignan are big deals in Australia, where I've also lived and made wine. But this one is done a little bit differently, as you might imagine. So this,
what grapes are you having your children hand squeeze on this one?
Well, I got pictures I can show you of my wife in the fermenter. Are actually holding that little wooden 1-ton basket press. The whole thing that she's holding weighs about 1,200 pounds. So it's all about technique. But it's
lift with your legs on that, right?
Yeah, and balance it. Yeah, but though there's a white grape in there called Monbedon, and Monbedon is a now almost extinct white grape varietal, and it has a very gelatinous pericarp, meaning that the fruit is like kind of snotty, so it's not very easy to press as a white grape. Mm-hmm. And I know about this because when I was working under Andrei Cheleschev at Beaulieu, we had a beautiful old vineyard also planted around 1900 up on Spring Mountain. And in order to get that, at that time, 80-something-year-old grapes, which went into the Georges Latour Private Reserve, we also had to get 10 tons of this Monbedon. And
which in California then was known as Burger.
Oh,
yeah. So my job as
no one calls it Monbedon. Only the French, when they can't speak English.
So it was my job as the junior winemaker to make sure that we could press that white grape, and it just blinded up the juice channels like crazy. I hated that stuff. And so when I was offered this fruit as well, and by the way, all of these vines came to me. I didn't seek them out. So when we started Marchelle, we actually started it only as Ancient Vines and named it after our 2 wives, my wife Mara and my business partner Kevin's wife Michelle, Mara, Michelle, Marchelle. And so we got this grapes also, and we're out there picking away, my wife and I, and the other winemakers are waiting over at the winery for the grapes to come in. And so when the pescadores got to these white grapes, they would go, no, the senor he doesn't want any white grapes. And my wife, who's a native Spanish speaker, and myself were going, no, we want the white grapes. Put them in. So this has about 10% Monbidon in it, which is, I think the vineyard's planted to about 10 or 12%. Is that right, Randy, of Monbidon?
Well, no, it can't be more than that, Greg.
Okay, yeah.
It's not a lot.
Yeah, but this is about 10 to 12%.
And about 1% Alicante Boucher.
Yeah, there's a little bit of Alicante in there. There's a vine or two of Flame Tokay in there. So, but
a vine or two of Flame Tokay could be like 3% of your total volume, right?
Yeah, it's true. But this is a pretty big block. So, so we were going, put it in. So when we got to the winery, once again, we laboriously separated out the white grapes. They went into the bottom of the fermenter. And then when we pressed it off, we had to hand squeeze these rather gelatinously pericarped grapes. But these other winemakers coming through in the winery, as they're coming through, my wife or I would take one of these berries off of the whole cluster that had this carbonic fermentation, popped it in the winemaker's mouth.
It's fucking delicious.
Yeah, that's like adult Pop Rocks. It's and these winemakers would be going like, wow, now that's winemaking. You know, we're in there, we're inside the fermenter, shoveling it out. We're doing the basket press thing. And I could see in these guys' eyes that they would rather be doing what I was doing, but I only make between 50 and 100 cases of each one of these wines that we're tasting. And they're a little on the pricey side. So you've got to make wine for both fun and profit. And I'm no longer in the profitable category, but we sure do have a lot of fun making it. And this is about 10% whole cluster with the Monbidon in it.
Now, keep in mind that they planted Burger for the same reasons, like in old days, they planted, Faux Blanche, and they used to use a lot of Thompson seedless, and what's another grape, like Green Hungarian. I mean, these grapes, they fell out of popularity because they don't make wines with a lot of flavor. But that used to be perfect for Jug Chablis. Right, you want it to be kind of neutral.
Well, so the question goes is when they make these decisions to plant Burger with Carignan, I mean that someone thought about that, and
Absolutely.
What was it? Was it, well, let's use it as an extender? Was there something that the Carignan wasn't giving them that the Burger was? And I'm saying Burger because I can't pronounce the other one. But I mean, these were conscious thoughts, and this was in 1900. I mean,
no, I would
do you
submit
think about that?
The old timers, from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, they knew what they were doing, right? And if they knew they needed a certain percentage of white grapes with less flavor, and then there's always more perfumey grapes, like Muscat, Riesling, Chenin Blanc, that you can also put into a blend to make a white wine. And so you want neutral grapes, along with more fragrant grapes, put it together, and that's the whole idea of blending. And the same thing for reds. You want Carignan for acidity, and you get a good price for it. You want Zinfandel also for that fruitiness, and maybe a little Petit for more color and all that. And nowadays they use Teraldigo for that, and you want maybe some Alicante, which gives you a lot of acid and a lot of tannin and color.
But with the Monbidon, if it's like that gelatinous, are you getting less liquid per ton than you would from a normal grape, or does it eventually break down into a liquid?
Eventually it turns into juice, but I do think that you have more dry matter in there, actually. And my own thought about these guys planting 133 years ago, they were thinking, 133 years from now, we're going to have some sucker who's going to have his wife in there
squeezing these berries
with her bare feet,
Do you think they ever thought that their vines would still be alive?
Oh, yeah. There's one very famous vineyard I think it's in southern Russia or maybe Georgia, where the guy was interviewed I don't know, he was over 100 years old, and he said that he planted that vineyard so that his grandchildren would have something to work with. Of course, he lived over like 108 or something like that.
Well, tell him about that.
So he never let his kids or his grandkids work in that shit.
Yeah. Well, tell him about that 120-year-old white wine vineyard that you utilize in the Russian River. Okay.
Oh, yeah. So there's
I almost sent you a message last night to see if he could bring a bottle of this.
All right, so let's tell the story. It's amazing.
So I did, but I dropped it off with a grower. So that is a French Colombard. And French Colombard's pretty easy to tell. It originally was called West's White Prolific because it is a very prolific producer. And up until the 1960s, it was the most widely planted white grape varietal in California.
And West, by the way, is George West, who founded El Pinal Winery in Stockton.
So it all comes together.
So he was the one that sort of discovered. I mean, they didn't discover. They got all their material from the Boston nurseries, just like everyone else. But he's
and then
the one
made up their names just like everyone else.
But it was called West White Prolific because he's the one that popularized it. Go ahead.
Yeah, and so originally there were some other winemakers that thought that the Monbedon in the Carignan was actually French Colombard, but I knew no way. We actually had to get Lucy Morton to solve that controversy for us, and it was indeed Monbedon. But we do have some French Colombard still left in Sonoma County, and it is an extremely late ripener. It's real easy to pick French Colombard in Sonoma County. You just wait until after it goes through one rain and before it's going to rot all to hell. Right. So, and that's when it's at 18 or 19 bricks.
White grapes on Thanksgiving.
Pretty much so. Yeah, we're picking those into October, late October.
Easier to get a crew.
But Colombard was very widely. It still is actually widely planted because it does great in the Central Valley.
Yeah,
it loves hot climate.
And it does that because it has such high acidity. And in the Central Valley, when it gets hot, grapes can drop acid faster than a hippie from the 60s. Although I resemble that remark a little bit. But
there was a bunch of people at a fish show at the Greek Theater last night. So not just the 60s.
So it holds acid really well. And in fact, we find that making French Colombard in Sonoma County, particularly from the Betty Ann Vineyard, which I have a little bit of brandy distilled from that vineyard that's going to go into a sparkling wine that we're going to be putting together pretty soon. Yeah. So this is brandy made from 131-year-old grapes.
Invited back to the show, I guess.
Yeah.
So Betty Ann is actually kind of a discovered block.
Yeah.
And growing among weeds that was planted early 1900s?
1902. It's a member of the Heritage Vineyard Society. Yeah. You have to have it documented, and it was documented in 1902. So it's at least that old. And Clark Lystra, who was the former president of the Russian River Valley Wine Growers Association, called me up and he said, "Can you tell me what I got here? There's a bunch of old abandoned vines sitting about a little higher up than your kneecaps, and just these little old ladies." And so I said, "Well, that's French Colombard." And we spent a couple of years, my wife and his wife and he and I, resuscitating those vines. And I think our first vintage that we were really trying to do anything, we got about 43 pounds. Year before last, we got a third of a ton. So it's going back to health. But
I've never heard a winemaker talk in terms of pounds. That was the first time I'd ever heard that.
So where is the vineyard? The vineyard is off a Hall Road, Hall in Irwin, and it's also home of some really nice Pinot Noir that's young and planted. And I think
gets picked months before the French Colombard.
Oh yes, right. Exactly. But there's a restaurant in Sonoma County called Single Thread that's got all 3 of its Michelin stars in 2 years, and is now one of the top 50 restaurants in the world. And they called me up and they said, "Can you make our house white for us?" And there's only 2 rules. it can't be Chardonnay. It has to be from Sonoma County. And I'd been working on this project with Clark Lystra. And I said, I've got just the right grapes for you. And so that became the House White for single thread. The pandemic came. They couldn't sell it all. So they, quote, sold some back to me for like a ridiculously low price. And that wine was the very beginning of Marchelle Wine. My business partner and I said, these are old vines. Let's name these after our wives because neither one of us would be here without them. And that was the beginning of Marchelle with these ancient vine.
So even though Colombard was a jug wine, though, there were a lot of wineries that produced varietal Colombard back in the 60s and 70s. Like, I'm talking about, Almaden and Gallo. Gallo actually produced a very respectable French Colombard. But it used to be, among the varietal listings, along with Chenin Blanc, Green Hungarian, and all the weird things that you don't see anymore. Sure. And people produce French Colombard, and you can go to a grocery store and be sitting there. You can buy a bottle or a jug, and it's in. And even Chalon at one point was making an old vine Colombard, and kind of like Greg's, very minerally and fragrant and crisp at the same time. Great acid, and so people with European taste would like it. People with California taste, because people with California taste like a lot of body and fruitiness, wouldn't like Colombard, which is why it's not considered nice anymore.
I need a bottle of this wine.
Greg, how do you go about resuscitating those vines?
Well,
first you got to clear the weeds out.
Yes, that's the first thing you do is you dig them out from the weeds. You keep the weeds out. You this is all being done organically, so we use organic compost on it, and sometimes things like that. There's some biodynamic preps that you can use to keep the weeds down too, but you have to be very selective with the shoots. These old vines, they want to survive. So what they're doing is they're putting out a ton of different shoots. And what you have to do is take off most of those shoots so that you can direct your energy just into a very few shoots that are healthy enough to produce grapes. And it takes a while to get those old gals kind of disciplined. They just want to get wild and do a lot of reproducing, and you got to help.
Well, they are vines, so
yes,
vines are supposed to put out
free love.
Vines.
So was this vineyard feral for quite a while? Was that what it was?
Yep.
Or was it just not managed correctly?
Well, it was a combination of sort of all of the above. It was kind of semi-abandoned. They were more ornaments than anything else. But I think Clark and his wife Bonnie have done a great job of husbanding those vines back to where it can be a significant portion of what we do. And another portion of that comes from the Cameron Ranch. And those vines are a lot younger. They're a spry 60 years old or something like that. So
Butch Cameron.
Yep. Yeah. Butch. Yeah. I used to buy stuff from Butch back in the day at Flowers. And I also used to buy Trousseau Gris from Peter Finucchi. And now all those things are really,
So how long did it take before they became productive again?
A couple of years before they really started putting out. And I was just by there this morning and saw that we did a few little different things, a little bit longer canes. We're going to rub out some buds. We still have frost possibilities, so we're not going to disbud anything until we see what kind of damage has been happening with them.
Have you guys ever met Phil Couturi?
It's been a long time. Great. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then Randy. No.
Randy lives out in Lodi with your cousins.
Oh, yeah, the Leventinis?
I haven't asked yet if he knows the Leventinis. Yeah. and he's not going to say anything else.
We don't have any Levantini wine here,
Do you want a
unfortunately.
glass of wine?
Sure, I'll taste it.
They're actually famous for their Barbera.
Oh, really?
Let's do this since
We don't.
Sunso first, yeah.
Somebody,
It's definitely the other side of the wine growing world, the Levantini family. Our cousins out there, they're making more on the bulk production.
right.
Yeah. The last time we saw them, we were comparing by the ton price for Zinfandel for what they get and what we get, and it's magnitudes difference.
Yeah. Well, there's so much Zinfandel out there that a lot of it is going for nothing.
Right.
Phil, we've been
or not going at all.
We've been having a total history lesson today, Phil.
Yeah, not the lower block down there. Lookout Ridge.
Oh yeah,
Not Lookout.
yeah. It was Signal Ridge.
No, it's Lookout Ridge.
Lookout Ridge. You're right.
With
Yeah.
Gordon Holmes.
Right. Yeah.
The wheelchairs, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Wheelchairs were
The
wide.
wheelchair
He got
project,
wiped
yeah.
out in Puerto Rico with
Yeah,
the
when it
big
was.
storm. Yeah. And then the earthquake.
Well, shall we go to the last one?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
this is the big blend, right?
Yeah. So this last wine is the blend of all of these grapes we just tasted, and
Wait, why? Just sorry. As a
well, remember how I said that you want to make wine for both fun and profit?
yeah.
Well, this is kind of more of the profit aspect.
Okay.
And,
But also because it does make really good wine.
Yeah.
Now, here's a funny part. So you guys have had Pasalacqua at your table too. He too makes an almost exact same blend, except he's very disciplined about it. It has to be 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 every year because he wants to see vintage variation. But also Old Vine Carignan, Old Vine Zinfandel, and Old Vine Sansol. Except the Zinfandel part comes from his own vineyard on the east side, 1915 vineyard. But he does the same thing. Sansol, Carignan,
Yeah.
Zinfandel blend.
Yeah.
So yours changes
every year it's different depending on how much we have, but most blends like this is kind of like the leftovers, or what you've got after you've done your vineyard designate.
Yeah.
We do this a bit backwards. We actually look at doing our blend first because we know that all the barrels that we have are going to be good. So we look and see what kind of blends are going to. We just want this to be the winner of the first empty glass contest. And whereas the other three, we didn't have any new oak. This has, let's see, about 20% new oak on it. So, and it's also made in higher quantities. So we made about an amazingly high 300 cases of this wine versus 50. So
Right.
we can sell this, for instance, by the glass at restaurants.
Right.
So I think this wine really puts it all together. You really do get the fragrance and the spices from Zinfandel. You get the delicate, fruit from the Sansol, and then you get the structure and the acidity of the Carignan, and then it really they do complement each other aromatically as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and this is the kind of thing that a lot of those, old field blend, mixed black kind of vineyards are basically Zinfandel, Carignan, and Cinsault.
Yeah.
And there's a reason that those survived and they work really well together, right?
Exactly. And so this is pretty much along just what you said, Sam. It's what somebody may have made like 130 years ago.
Yeah, you can see why Zinfandel and Carignan are good traditional blenders. It's Sansol not so much because it was never as popular, but I think it was grown because it grows well. It's Mediterranean grape, but aromatically and texturally, Carignan Zin they work well.
And what I like about this is that the way that little bit of oak that you've used here kind of brings it all, kind of is like the glue that brings it all together. It doesn't come across as a new oak wine, but it adds a little richness and sort of it's the glue.
Now there is a Lodi thread in this wine too. There's just that faint smidgen of a loamy earthiness to it, just a trace of compost or whatever. That's very Lodi, and that you only find on that side of Lodi. You don't even find it on the other side of Lodi. It's only on the west side of Lodi.
Yeah, you're on the west side of Lodi.
For these wines, grapes are all west side. Yeah. So you don't get earthiness or loaminess on the east side. If that's all perfume.
Because that's the more sandy, gravelly soils there.
No gravel in these areas, but it is a little more beach sandy. It's a variation of the same soil, a little deeper and a little sandier
on the east side.
Yeah, and so consequently, vine size is smaller, clusters weight is lower, berry size is smaller, and then one of the results is less earthiness.
Randy, I've been waiting to get back to the soil. Do you know the geological history of this area? How it got to be so deep and so perfect
it's a watershed area. So it's the McCullum River is the biggest river, and it's dammed now in 3 places. And there's 2 reservoirs, Comanche and Pardee, in between Lodi and the foothills, and so it's controlled these days. But that used to be a wild, raging river, and so in the 1800s, the water table was all the way up to about 5 feet below the surface. Now it's more like 60, and so the river is controlled, so the soil, it's not like it's ancient soil. It's soil that probably averages around 15,000 years in age. So it's basically just decomposed granite. Granite is the base rock of the Sierra Nevada, and just mixed in there with loam to create that a deep alluvium. And so that's what makes it unique, because as you know, this is also the area that dips right into the delta, which then the delta area is primarily below sea level, and then whereas these areas I'm talking about are anywhere from 5 to about 90 feet above sea level. So it's still flat, but it's not quite the delta, because once you get into the delta, you get a peat type soil, because those historically are usually underwater. Not now. They got a lot of Chinese guys that make those levees, and so, but
still a much higher silt number.
Yes, it's a peat soil,
Yeah.
so it's much richer. It is sandy. It's great for asparagus and
Love that asparagus.
Belgian endive, and you can grow grapes there. Yeah. There's actually a lot of Pinot Noir out there, and so a lot of commercial Pinot. So that's what makes that area sort of unique. Is that soil. So it's a watershed soil. But once you get outside, most of Lodi is actually more odor type soils, rocky, volcanic types, hillside type soils. And that's about 60% of the appellation. And those are much older. Those are 500,000 years old type soils. So these are young alluvial soils that were the Zinfandels. So the old timers always knew that you could plant great flame tokay and Zinfandel in these sandy soils. Zinfandel loved that. But once you got, went a few feet and got into, say, more of a terrace, sandy clay type soil, you're going to hit a hard pan, within 3 or 4 feet. You're not going to get the deep rooting, and it's not as rich. The sandy loam soil is much richer than those sandy clay types rocky soils.
Are these own rooted?
So these are all own rooted vines. Because phylloxera doesn't proliferate in the sandy loam. It exists, but it's more on the surface. And in these type of soils, you can get pretty deep rooting. So
is this co-fermented or blended?
It's blended.
Yeah. So it's not.
You've worked all over the world, and when it came to a certain point of your career, and I've heard you say this, where you just didn't want to work with assholes anymore. You just kind of wanted to do your own thing.
Well, with the exception of
if you don't want to work with assholes,
right.
you have to do your own thing in this business.
Yeah.
So you don't need more than one in a room.
Right. He only wants to work with one anymore. He's got to look him in the mirror every day. But did you worked with grapes from Lodi, and why was it that you decided that this kind of was going to be what you started to kind of do as your passion project, that this is what you're going to spend your free time doing?
Well, I'm I'm not just making wine so much anymore. I'm doing this because I really love the people and the land, and the people in Lodi are some of the most authentic people I've ever met. These guys are real farmers. There's no pretension. It's pretty down to earth. Everyone's willing to help everyone else out. It feels a lot like what the Napa Valley was like, 40 or 50 years ago. And I love the people there. I love the atmosphere. And it just so happens that they have some great grapes, including some of the world's oldest vines of any varietal you could imagine. And that keeps me coming back because it's all about what I'm doing. I love, I'm passionate about, and I feel really free to be myself in Lodi, and I don't get treated like with kid gloves or anything there. I'm just another farmer like everyone else. And to tell you the truth, that's the way I really like it. I love the people of Lodi.
Going from small berries to big berries, was it a big hard transition? I mean, the Pinot Noir was your bread and butter.
Yeah, well, that's a good question, Phil.
Let's repeat the question just because the airplane and the microphone and the speaker. Going from the little berries of the Pinot Noir to the big berries of the Cinsault and the Carignan and the Zinfandel.
Yeah. So it turns out that we're doing a series of trials right now. There are certain farming techniques that you can do. And my first degree was in plant biology. So I really approach things from a vine physiology standpoint. There are certain things you can do, one which is called carbohydrate repartitioning strategy. I think, Phil, you and I have talked about that, where you can actually get smaller berries. And the growers that I'm working with, including Acquiesce Winery, have actually shown, there's Rodney, one of the owners there, he's meticulously gone through in these areas where they pulled leaves at a certain time, like right around flowering, to create more shatter and open up your cluster architecture. But then you also need to continue that momentary carbohydrate deficiency into berry cell division and berry cell expansion. Now, before people's eyes start glazing over, the three most important moments of winemaking occur before a berry has ever made it into the winery. The best place to make wine is in the vineyard. And those three most important moments are flowering, berry cell division, and berry cell expansion. And if you can have more open cluster architecture, and by the way, you're going to get better bud fruitfulness for the following year because you get more solar penetration and you get more grapes and less tendrils because you differentiate your bud primordia. But if you can continue that carbohydrate deficiency into berry cell division, you have fewer cells per berry, means smaller berries. If you then continue it into berry cell expansion, instead of big cells, you get little cells, you get smaller berries. And one of the things that Acquiesce and some of the other folks out there, I think Twin Oaks or some other folks have been doing that, have shown that if you apply this, you can get smaller berries, more open cluster architecture. And then, by God, you can put a lot of winemakers out of business just by giving them good fruit and making them kind of like vestigial winemakers, you know? That's kind of like what I'd like to see, is having great grapes come into the winery so that there's no excuse for the winemaker anymore. You can't blame it on the vineyard, which happens a lot.
No, if it's a bad year, it's the vineyard. If it's a good year, it's the winemaker.
Well, yeah.
And that,
we have a saying that the biggest vertebrate pests in a vineyard are winemakers, but that assumes that winemakers actually have backbones. And so, sorry to my winemaker friends out there.
the Cinsault really reminds me of Napa Valley Gamay.
Valdegay, yeah.
And Napa Valley Gamay is is a larger berried varietal, has that the aromatics. It's right there. And if you try to grow Napa Valley Gamay right now in Napa Valley, they'd probably throw you out.
Yeah. Well, there's the Cinsault, though, it has more spice notes than the Valdegay would ever have.
Yeah.
And the Lower family still produces beautiful Valdegay down there in Salinas Valley, or Arroyo Seco AVA. It's still fantastic, and I'm glad someone's still doing
Michael
that.
Cruz is still doing some Valdegay, I think.
Yeah,
Billy D also, Billy Davies, the Schramsberg family. He's making some Valdegay from Buddha's Dharma up in Mendocino County, and it's really good.
Still nice grape, you know.
Russell Cundiff up on top of Sonoma Mountain at Napa Gamay.
All right.
And the Brunings at Napa Valley.
Yeah, so it was always a good wine.
Yeah, it was a great wine. And you wouldn't have a problem with mildew. It just sort of muscle its way through everything.
Yeah. So you're right though. What gives Senso its character is the fact that it is almost like a table grape. It's a large cluster and large berries and fairly thin skins, and so
incredible spice.
Yeah, a lot of spice. So, and which is why it's so important. If you look at any of the numbers of any major Chateauneuf du Pape producer, they all have Senso in it. It is considered important. It's as important as Petit Verdot or Malbec is in Bordeaux. It's almost like you must have Senso in that blend. So
another one of those reasons I feel, and especially with Carignan and the mixed black vineyards, when you have Zinfandel, I don't care where it is, you're going to have dehydration happening, and it's going to spike. And instead of adding water, it's Senso, a little Carignan. It create that balance.
Yeah.
You know, Jesus units are real.
Yeah. So, and Carignan in Lodi is usually among the first to be planted. I mean, to be brought in, harvested. So we usually have it by mid-August or so. Sometimes it might get into early September, but it's usually a mid-August a pick, which is maybe a couple weeks before most of it's in.
Well, I was actually gonna ask you about that, Greg. The 2020s have none of the problems that many people associate with the 2020 vintage. Those wines, none of them had any smoke at all.
Yeah.
I didn't want to. It's like a 4-letter word. I didn't want to say it.
There's also no new oak in those.
So what were your sort of throwback to 2020 pick dates for those three wines?
Well, let's see. The Carignan was picked last. That was picked in late September. That particular vineyard, for whatever reason, takes longer to ripen. The Zinfandel that year was picked September 2nd or 3rd, and the Senso was picked about 10 days after that, approximately to 2 weeks.
So all sort of in that mid-September range.
Early to mid-September, yeah. Well, those three, early to first week to third week of September. Yeah.
But we didn't have the fires next to Lodi. Right. We're more of that area where smoke would be
high,
way above, going from here to there. So, riding with the Delta wind down south. And so we didn't have, smoke taint
issues
per se. Right. Issues in Lodi, luckily, knock on wood, because we don't have forested areas right next to us. We have a delta.
Delta breezes.
Yeah. Right. So, yeah. Lodi's been lucky in that sense,
Nothing to burn. Right.
Yeah.
Well, the peat starts to burn, and that adds another flavor.
Yeah. That's called Scotch, right?
Yeah.
Really nice. Great to see you.
Same here.
Pleasure.
Phil? Yeah. Hey, thanks.
Yeah. Really enjoyable.
Well, Greg, since I'm now revisiting the Senso, and we kind of talked about that savory, kind of smoky, venison, meaty kind of thing, I wanted to ask you about yeast, but I almost didn't want to ask you about yeast because I've heard you talk before, and
natter on for hours, yeah.
And yeah, I don't think we can talk long enough. But just briefly, maybe give a little of your philosophy on inoculation versus a wild yeast.
Well, yeah, inoculation is always the safest route to go. It's reliable. It finishes properly. It doesn't get beaten up by other stuff. Whereas when you're not inoculating, just about anything can happen, and oftentimes does. But when you don't inoculate, and I just gave a talk back at the Eastern Technical Symposium on this. I can send you a copy of my PowerPoint if you'd like.
And I think you've heard you say, if you have trouble sleeping at night,
it's very soporific. Yeah. Yeah. But basically, wild ferments have been shown to produce more esters and aromas, and there's more complexity in those. They might not have as strong of a fruit component as a yeast that you might select and choose, but you get more complexity
and layers.
And I don't want my wines to be pow, like a fruit riot in the mouth, although that's fun.
Comic book.
Yeah, I really, as I'm getting older, I'm looking for more gentility and complexity, not just in my life, but in my grapes. And I think that wines should reflect the people who make them. So when I was an angry young man, I made angry young Pinots, for instance, like out at Flowers, these big wonkin' things. But that was like showing people that you could teach the dog to speak, to bark. Now I want to teach it how to elocute, to really say something about a region or a site. I don't just want to make Zinfandel. I want to make royalty Lodi Zinfandel. And I also more than ever want to interact with the people with whom I'm making the wines. That's really important to me. I live on the vineyard that I farm. My grandkids are growing up on it, and some of my best friends are there. I want to give a shout out to Evan Damiano, who couldn't be here. He had to attend some other stuff, but all of these people have become really important to me. And so winemaking itself has become much more than just making wine. When I was a kid or a young man, I thought that my life was in service to the grape. But as I'm getting older, I'm finding that the grape is in service to my life and giving me a really great life. And for people who are out there listening, I'd like to say thank you from all of us hose draggers for enjoying fine wines and buying our product so that we can keep doing what we love to do. And I promise you that all of us hose hounds and hose jockeys are going to make wine that you love. And comment to us, send us comments and tell us what it is that you like or don't like and how you'd like to see us move, because winemaking is a very interactive thing. And one of the best things I like to see and hear is from people who are really enjoying the wines or who maybe have some opinions about how things could be a little bit different. That's now the important thing for me.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Well,
you said gentility, and I'm a deadhead, as we talked about, and the lyrics to "I Need a Miracle" popped into my head. The first verse: "I need a woman about twice my age. I need a lady of nobility, gentility, and rage. A splendor in the dark, a lightning on the draw, who go right through the book and break each and every law." And that sounds kind of like where you've landed in this career of yours, Greg.
Yeah, and that's why I'm also a deadhead, or I'm not quite a deadhead, but I'm a fan.
All right, fair enough.
Yeah, I've attended a couple of concerts, so yeah.
I'm strictly American Beauty and Working Man's Dead. That's it.
American Beauties. That's my classic album right there, man.
There you go.
Ripple.
Well, you guys, let's.
What we haven't said once is how you get these freaking wines.
Well, it sounds like there's not really a lot of.
You're
them.
not.
I don't.
Oh, and Randy's book. Well, we have a copy of Randy's book. We need the French column part, really.
Yeah, I'll get you some of that.
The Lodi book is easy. Amazon.
Lodi !
Yeah, but I also have my own website. It's called Kitchen Cinco, CINCO Press, and if you buy from there, I get a little more out of it. I don't have to
Jeff
give
Bezos
Jeff Bezos 60%.
Yeah.
and so the wine, obviously, you just go to Marchelle.
It's
wine.com.
Marchelle Wines, MARCHELLE wines.com. And that's the best way to get a hold of our wines, because we really we're so small. You're not going to find us in big box stores.
Right.
So, and if you go on there right now, some of these wines are available because people listen to the show. Shout out Travis Barkley, who went and bought all the Monterey cellars he could find. People listen to the show all over the country and then try and order the wine. So if you went on right now, you'd be able to get some of these wines on the website.
You bet.
Okay.
I'm not sure that the family cuvee is on there yet, but if it's not now, it will be in the next
Well,
few days. I'll
there's
make
no
sure.
label.
Yeah. We got to
You,
finish.
you have
labeling
until Friday. This is Wednesday morning. You have until Friday morning when the show drops.
it. I'll let Kevin know. We'll put it on the list.
Well, as you guys can see out there, I think you've noticed over the last year that the talk about Lodi has gotten a little more fervor. There's a little more buzz going on. This
A lot of that's thanks to the guy sitting right here at the table.
this is one of those areas that you're going to see a lot more people asking for wines from Lodi. So we're here. What we're here saying today is, here you go.
Yep.
Try some of these wines. I mean, you want to see what's
Marchelle,
unique, what's
Perlegos.
different about these wines? Here's your opportunity. Yeah.
And to credit to Randy's book, if you want to learn about the growers and the winemakers, you can go deep on the book.
And the book is beautiful, Randy.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I definitely distracted myself during the Perlegos interviews, flipping through and not paying attention. The ADHD, the pretty pictures got me.
So, and it is true though that Lodi wines are everywhere, but you know there's a commercial style that's out in the big box stores and the supermarkets, and but the handcraft stuff, you go to individual producers such as Marchelle, or you mentioned Montreal or Sandlands and Turley. Those are all the handcraft styles. Best yet, go on out to Lodi and meet some of those multi-generational families who, many of these growers who have been around since the 1850s or 1860s now own wineries, and they own most of the wineries out there. And that's what makes Lodi a little unusual, is that it is a place where, kind of like what Napa and Sonoma used to be, where if you walked in, you know, the guy who might be pouring the wine for you to taste could be the owner or the grape grower or the winemaker.
And there's things, there's
Yeah.
new exciting restaurants and things to do in Lodi. I mean, Lodi for a number of years has definitely been on the uptick. It's not just a farming town anymore.
Yeah,
Is that fair to say?
It's one of those little old towns, and God forbid in another 20 years it'll be like Hillsburg or so. But
Good for property values,
but
bad for
but
homeowners.
hopefully I'll be dead and gone by then. But it's still, it's a farming town still, and where you do find some nice restaurants too.
What's it?
Guantonio's.
Guantonio's. Everybody's.
Yeah, that's pizzas and salads.
But that's the
it's
best
fresh.
pizzas in California. Everybody's like talking about Gotta get out there. I can't eat pizza anyway, but
But I think maybe part of the reason people would want to go is not because of nice restaurants or hotels. It's to go because we
it's
hear
real.
people here in the tasting room every day talk about how Sonoma and Napa used to be. And,
Right.
And
The good old
and
days.
right. And so head out to Lodi and see, and like you
How
said,
it used to
meet
be.
some real people who are making some good, honest wines from their properties, and wax poetic.
That is a good reason to go.
Yeah.
You know, where you get a
And
little
let's not
bit,
turn it into Hillsburg.
Yeah. You
Yeah.
get as Greg mentioned, you know, so you get some real people.
Yeah.
It's still farmers.
Yeah.
It's a farming region still. I
Yeah.
mean, you know, it's not a winery region. It's a farming
Right.
region. So, which is weird. But
no, it's good. But the last time I drove through Lodi, I was pleasantly surprised with how many you could pull in, go taste wine. There's like a trail of tasting rooms and wineries with tasting rooms, just
Right.
more than I think I anticipated. So definitely come to Sonoma also, but go check out Lodi on your next California wine trip.
Yeah, I might mention that the Lodi Wine Center on Turner Road is probably a good place for people to get more information and
Right.
just start discovering.
yeah, because they have a good sampling of a lot of Lodi wines, and that place, the Lodi Visitor Center, is owned by the Lodi Wine Grape Commission. And so if you heard about Lodi, a lot of it is because of the work, which I do work for, the Lodi Wine Grape Commission, and that consists of about 750 grape growers. It's not a winery association; it's a grape growers association. Right. Yeah, but because it's a large wine region, we're probably the best funded wine regional association
average,
in the
capita.
state, because we have so many darn growers, and it's not like you have a choice too. If you grow grapes in Lodi, you have to belong to the Lodi Wine Grape Commission. It's voted in, and then once it's voted in, you got to pay your taxes. And so, but we've been working hard. I do the freelance work for them, and we work hard to let the rest of the world know about this place.
And thanks for sharing the wines. All the ones.
We have to close with.
Oh boy.
No. Yeah. Little Creedence Clearwater.
Thank you guys for coming today.
That's the best song.
Yeah,
that really is.
Thanks for doing what you guys do. That's
cool.
It means a lot to someone like me to do what I get to do because of what you guys do. So thank you.
Absolutely. We're glad we got to make a connection.
Yeah.
No Lodi.
Oh yeah.